Hi and welcome to tonight's live webinar, Music Tech Basics. Tonight we're going to be looking at another sonic quality. This time we're looking at frequencies and frequency manipulation, and we'll be talking about the frequency range and how to control these within your mix. So as always, feel free to use the Q&A to ask a few questions and we'll bat around some ideas. Also feel free to use the discussion panel or any other means of discussion. I'll try and answer any questions during the Q&A session. Okay, so this is how the content's going to be broken down for tonight's show. We're going to start by looking at how the frequencies are managed within the different stages. So starting at recording, mixing and then mastering. And then we're going to look at the frequency range in its kind of entirety. Then we're going to look at how the frequencies work within individual instruments and voices. Then we're going to look at some of the parameters and some of the tools that we use to kind of control these, EQs and filters being the main ways of controlling them within our mixes. And then finally onto a Q&A. So the recording, mixing and mastering, just like with the dynamics of last week, each section has its own way of being controlled. The first thing within frequencies actually starts with the microphone. All microphones are not created equal, and you're going to need to think very carefully about the microphone that you use when you're trying to capture a specific sound. Certain people like different microphones for their sonic qualities and their kind of overall sound textures. This is mainly to do with the frequency response charts. All microphones have a different frequency response chart based on how they're built. The more expensive microphones have an almost flat zero frequency response, meaning that they're very clear, meaning that they respond to any kind of recordings. However, that's very rare, and most will have some, and I'll show you a frequency response chart in just a moment. The next bit, so as we're recording in, apart from thinking about the frequency response of the actual microphone itself, the actual recording stage, you generally leave this clean. You don't touch the EQ during this stage because you can manage this during the mixing stage more effectively. Unless you're doing live recordings, in which case you're definitely going to want to EQ. But if you're dealing with production and studio-based production, you're definitely going to want to manage all the EQ during the mixing stage, okay? Which brings us on to the mixing stage. Now within the mixing stage, we're really looking at creating space for our instruments. Now the reason we think about the sonic quality is because there are 4 ways of creating space for a particular sound, okay? And EQ is one of those ways. If you were just to use dynamics on its own, you wouldn't be able to create the wide array of space that you would want from a mix, making sure that everyone's instrument or everyone's voice can be heard very clearly if you're listening to it. So we need to control the mix stage. We need to control each and every voice and instrument as they come through. And you can see from this mixing panel that in order to create the space, the EQ adjustments that we use are all different for each one, and that gives us that space. And then finally, we look at mastering. Mastering, as I said previously, is a very specific area. It's a very specialist area. But as a general rule of thumb, what you're looking for when you're mastering an EQ is you're looking for this enhancement and this polish, as it were. And this normally comes from having a boost at the low frequencies and a boost at the very high frequencies, giving these textures that don't necessarily mess with the mix, but they just kind of add a little bit of depth to the actual recording itself. Okay, so the frequency response of a microphone, really important when you're looking at it. Now this is a really common microphone frequency chart. This is the Shure SM58. Now as you can see, we're really looking at this 0 line here. So as we look across, you're looking for this flat line. And there's a few reasons that this microphone has this kind of high cut, or sorry, low cut here. Is mainly because the SM58 is a live microphone. So when singers are singing into this microphone, it's normally during a live performance, okay? So we have this cut, these frequency cuts here, purely so that none of that sound gets captured during the live. So that's a deliberate thing. Rather than looking at this flat line, that's an actual deliberate thing that that has been put in by the manufacturers. Okay, and it's the same because the SM58 is generally a live microphone. It's generally for vocalists, and they do want a bit of shine to their mix, or shine to their voices. Sorry, you're also going to get this kind of boost area around these top frequencies. And if you look at your when you analyze your vocals, you're going to see that there's a lot of sound characteristics all around these areas, and these nice kind of lush areas within a vocal are quite nice. So that's why they've been pulled out, and then all the top end, which would produce the sibilants, have been cut out from it completely. Now, a lot of microphones don't sit around the 0 dB. A lot of the kind of cheaper made ones, you'll find that in order to enhance their sound, their frequency chart starts up here somewhere, the +10 or the +5, and you've got to be very careful about that, because it can almost look like a flat chart, but when you analyze it a bit differently, you start to see that actually the way that they interpret this kind of diagram is always different. So just be very careful when you're buying equipment, that you make sure that you get the best possible sound. It's always a good idea to test your equipment before you buy it, of course, if you're starting out. Okay. So next, the frequency range. How is all this built up? A bit of mathsy stuff here, and it's fairly simple to understand. So we're looking at the hertz into kilohertz. So 1,000 hertz is 1 kilohertz, and obviously we can break that down further by looking at cycles per second. So one cycle is 1 hertz, and you can see from this sine wave here that as you produce more sine waves per second, the frequency is going to get higher, and this is what's happening. Okay, so in order to produce the first lowest C tone, which is down here, the C1, you need 33 cycles per second to produce 33 hertz. Okay, and as that creeps up, you're going to see that it goes all the way from 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz. Okay, and you'll quite often hear people say, "Oh, I've got 20/20 vision." Well, it's the same with hearing. You've got 20/20 hearing as well, 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz. So it's worth kind of keeping that in mind as well. So that's a general overview of how the frequency range is built up, looking at the low frequencies within the hertz, looking at these low mids within the 160 hertz to kind of 400 hertz, looking at the low treble, 1 kilohertz to 3 kilohertz, and then you've got the high trebles, the upper end. Okay. Now, it's really important, even if you've got the best ears in the business, it's really important to have an understanding of how to analyze frequencies, because overall, when we're doing these tasks and we're doing these jobs, we are looking at creating space for our instruments. So understanding how an instrument or a voice works is going to be paramount to kind of sculpting it to make it kind of clear. Now, this tool here is fantastic. Independentrecording.net. I've got a few little tools and they're all free, so it's worth checking out, and I'm constantly using this with my students and for myself actually. Now, just bear with me for 2 seconds. I'm going to switch over to their web page. I'm just going to take you through the tool and kind of show you how it works and how you can benefit from kind of understanding how to shape the frequencies within an individual sound. Okay, so just bear with me for 2 seconds and I'll try and bring up the right screen. Here we go. So this is, hopefully you can all see that. Let me move this out of the way just so I can rearrange that. Sorry about this. Okay, so this is an interactive diagram. So if we hover over with our mouse this male vocal here, you'll notice that over here in this spectrum data, it gives us some vital information about what should be happening. And also, if you look at your EQ scopes or your analyzing parameter within your EQ, you should see the diagram emulating kind of these frequencies. Okay, so what's it saying? So in this red area here, we're looking at the mid-range of a male vocal. Okay, and we're looking at 250 hertz to 2 kilohertz, having a low order of harmonics for most instruments, and if you use too much 500 to 1 kHz, this can be a bit what they term as honky, so that's a good expression. And if you use too much 1K to 2K hertz, this can be a bit tinny. So it's giving you some nice information about that. And underneath where it says instrument data, it says male vocal. And if you want a full-bodied male vocal, you can tweak the 120 hertz. If you want a bit more boom, you can tweak the 240 hertz. Bit of presence. Reduce the sibilance. We tried to get rid of as much sibilance as possible within our mix, so that's around the 4 kilohertz to 9 kilohertz within a male vocal. And then the breathiness within a vocal, you've got 10 kilohertz to 16 kilohertz. So lots of really good information there. If you scroll over to the yellow section, it will give you some mid-range information, and it kind of breaks down on how that works. And then finally over into the high frequency information. And each of these instruments is the same. It has this information that you can interpret for your own mix. And it just gives you some ideas about what would be happening if you boosted that region or if you cut that region. Another thing to remember when we're talking about frequencies is normally, in most cases, better to cut a frequency than it is to boost a frequency. All too often, I will see, including myself, I will see people boosting frequencies, and then what you get is this kind of area where everything's boosted around the same area. And really, it's sometimes easier to cut the frequencies to sculpt it than it is to boost it. That's not to say you can't boost frequencies, because I will quite often boost my vocal frequencies, around that kind of high mid area to kind of get this kind of nice bright shiny sound. Which leads me on to early day mixing as well, where you've got two spectrums of thought here. An early day mix, when you first start out, you'll either have too much boom or you have too much treble. Okay, and when I started out, I always think about this first mix that I did. I was loving it. I was soloing all the instruments and I was kind of finding all their sweet spots and really shaping them. And then when I played them all together, it was like, oh my god, what have I done? It's so tinny and so kind of full of kind of treble. So then obviously I had to rip it apart and do it again. And it's not until you get a finer tuned ear and you think, actually, if you've done your job properly and you've recorded everything the way it should be recorded, actually, when we use EQ and we use filters, this is really just to shape what we've already done to give it space, okay? Unless you're going for something weird and wonderful, of course, that's normally, and that's the way EQing should be considered, okay? So it's to give it space. Okay. Bear with me once again and we'll go back over to the presentation. So hopefully you find that, and you should definitely bookmark this page. So that's independentrecording.net. So definitely bookmark that page. I'm always using it and I just think it's such an amazing resource. So back to my presentation. Where are you? There you are. Okay, fantastic. So moving on, we're just going to look at some EQs now. So we're going to start with the parametric EQ. And we're going to look at specific filters that are used within the parametric EQ. And those are bandpass filters and notch filters. They can be used in many different ways. Ultimately, they are to shape a sound, but they can be used for effect as well. So if you were thinking about a wah-wah, a wah-wah would use a bandpass filter to kind of automate through the frequencies. If you think about a wah-wah pedal and what that does, that's what it's doing. It's using a bandpass filter and it's kind of swooshing through the frequencies, okay? This is more of a static approach when you think about mixing, but it's certainly appropriate to do that. So let's look at the parameters that build up these specific bandpass and notch filters, okay? So we have the first factor, which is this center frequency. Now, when it's on a bandpass or notch filter, it's called a center frequency. When it's on a high pass or a low pass filter, it's called a cutoff point, okay? So it's important that you know that is the terminology used. And it's basically this point here that transitions through the frequency. So you can see it's controlled here, and at this particular point, it's actually at 405 hertz, okay? And then that controls everything else. This next parameter here is a volume or cut boost for those specific frequencies. And it's important that, yes, it is a volume boost, but it is only for these frequencies. And unless really needed to, I wouldn't recommend you boosting much past 5 decibels, okay, 5-6 decibels. It starts to add digital artifacts after that point, which can sometimes not be appropriate. But I mean, that's completely up to you and how you mix. But I would say that plus 13 is excessive for most situations. Finally, we have this Q, or bandwidth. Now, the higher the number, the smaller the envelope. Now, this is the envelope here, and you can see I've got 4, or what's called a 4 bandwidth, and it's just making this bandpass filter this kind of shape. Now, if you look at the notch filter, which is this one here, you can see it's now 100, and look how much thinner it is. Okay, so a notch filter, unlike a bandpass, which is kind of used to accentuate a specific frequency, a notch filter is very specific to cutting frequencies. Okay, if you have a certain frequency that you absolutely hate, the notch filter is the way to go. So you can actually just remove that particular frequency, and you quite often see this in mixing, where they'll use the notch filter combined with bandpass filters. So the parametric EQ and the graphic equalizer, which we'll see in a moment, are almost identical, and they are literally used to kind of shape the individual instruments, or the master track or the input track, whichever part of the process you're working on. And they are used in conjunction with each other, so they're never generally done as one thing. To shape a particular sound, you're going to use multiple of these, and this is what we've got now. And I can't remember what instrument this is on, but we've got this kind of shape where we're boosting around these. And there's certain things that you should know about using EQ, and there's some really good resources. A guy called Paul White has a basics series of books which are absolutely essential to reading. And he talks in depth about EQ and how to control it. So, if you want to have a look at kind of what things you can do within EQ that are kind of appropriate and must-dos to clean up your sound or to shape it. Okay, so this is what we've got so far with our parametric EQ, and as you can see along the top, you've got multiple here. This one here is our high-pass filter. This one here is our low shelf, and the same here, we have our low-pass filter and our high shelf, and then here we have 4 bandpass stroke notch filters. Okay, so in total we have 8 different ways of shaping this particular parametric EQ. Okay, now when we look at the graphic equalizer, in contrast, we have 31 band graphic equalizer here. They come in different shapes or forms, not always 31. 31 seems to be a bit of an odd number. Normally I'm used to 24 and so forth, but it doesn't matter. And what you've basically got here is 31 volume dials, and each one of these volume dials is kind of shaping a specific notch or bandpass filter. So as you bring it up, it's changing the shape, okay? Or as you bring it down, it's changing the shape. And it's quite a nice graphic from this particular plugin. And it kind of shows how the curves are working. And without those curves, it's quite easy to kind of not understand what a graphic equalizer does until you're playing. It always takes me back to, well, when I was younger and my mum had a graphic equalizer for her car stereo. And I used to love playing with the bass frequencies and was listening to Michael Jackson's Thriller, I think it was, during the 80s. And we were pushing these bass frequencies against some real pumpers were going down. My mum's getting mad at the same time. Fantastic stuff, of course. Don't see many graphic equalizers anymore, but in car speakers. But there you are. That's so very similar to parametric EQ, but just a different way of controlling it. Some people like this way of controlling frequencies a lot better. I personally have grown up using through my days of production, I've grown up using the kind of parametric, so that's the one I'm most used to. Okay, so let's look at the pass filters. As said previously, we have this high pass filter and this low pass filter. Now, it seems quite strange that the high pass filter would be at the low end and so on, but what you've got to remember about this is it cuts all the low frequencies and leaves the high frequencies. So as you extend this cutoff point out further, it's basically going to reduce all of the information or the volumes or the data that come before it, okay? So all this information here will be cut off and reduced and cut out, okay? And it's the same with the low pass filter. It leaves the low information intact, and it gradually, as you pull off the center point, which you can't actually see here for some reason, as you pull the center point out, it reduces all the high frequencies and leaves the low frequencies intact. So a lot of my students get confused with that terminology because it all seems a bit backwards, and I guess that's important to remember that it is backwards in the way that a lot of people think about these things. But yeah, that's what they're called, and that's the terminology you should use, okay? So we have a cutoff point rather than a center frequency. Same thing again, it controls the position of the filter or the pass filter and where it is and how much you can kind of reduce. This is used in a lot of songs, especially dance songs, where they use a high pass or a low pass filter to kind of create this swooshing sound where there's kind of like this tinny vocal sound, and then all of a sudden the drums come in and it's this full bodied sound. It's very effective, especially in dance music, and you'll find that a lot. The next parameter along is the slope. Okay, so the slope determines, kind of as it suggests, is this slope here. So the more you adjust this, you can either have a slope that cuts across, whoops, so you can have a slope that cuts across, or you can have one that's sharp down, depending on how you adjust this one, okay? And then finally, you have slope and resonance. It's mainly resonance. And what resonance does, and you'll see this in a lot of synthesizers and samplers, is you can actually control the cutoff and you can control the resonance. Now, the higher the number you have here, the more resonance you have. So this peak here would go up, okay? So if you turn this dial up, this peak here would go up. This line would flatten out a bit more. And it just gives you this tonal quality that's yeah, it's I won't say it's always nice, but it's certainly something. Okay, so those are the ways. And what I would say probably now, if you're not watching this live and you're watching this kind of after the thing, is get a song loaded up into your DAW, be it Logic or Cubase or one of the others. Plug in one of your favourite songs and have a go at automating either a high pass filter or a low pass filter. And just see what it does. And I think once you start using them, they're fantastic. Okay, so next one we're going to look at is shelves. So unlike, and I should have said this before, unlike pass filters, they really do only reduce the volume, okay? Reduce the volume of the frequencies that they affect. You cannot boost a frequency using a pass filter, either high pass or low pass, okay? And that's where shelves come in. Okay, so on this particular diagram, this is the shelves here, these ones here, and these ones here are the pass filters, okay? Now, the shelf filters work almost identical to the pass filters, but you can boost as well as cut. And that's quite important. It makes them a lot more flexible, in fact. And let's look at the same things here. So here, this middle one is for boosting and cutting the volumes. This top one, now I've got the diagram over here, is your cutoff point. Same thing again, where you can pull the cutoff point out and manipulate the frequencies. And then finally, we have the slope stroke resonance, which you can see here again. The higher the value, the more resonance you're going to get, and the straighter the slope. Okay, so once again, if you haven't done this before, you should definitely try it out and see how you get on with actually create it with your favorite track or whatever, and just put a high shelf or a low shelf on that track and automate it and sweep through the frequencies. It can also be used as a good arrangement tool. You know, so if you hit, say, a middle 8, you can use the high pass or the low pass filter or shelf to kind of get rid of everything apart from the vocal, you know, or the set of frequencies above 2 kilohertz, for instance. So really effective techniques for arranging as well. Okay, that was swift. So it brings us on to our Q&A. Now, there's been a couple of questions this week. How do I know what frequencies to manipulate? And my answer to this is practice makes perfect. The more you do these things, the better you get. The more tracks you mix, the more tracks you record, the better you get at shaping how things work. A music engineer, producer will work solidly day in and day out on producing records. That's what they do. And every time they produce a new record, they come out with new results and they try new things and they get better and better and better. And it never stops. You must experiment with this stuff. Sometimes you're going to get results that suck, and other times you're going to get results that are absolutely mind-blowing. But it is the only way that you can really hear what's going on, is the more you practice at shaping these things. So that was the first one. Next one is why do I need to analyze frequencies? Why can't I just use my my ear, and that's fine. However, you've got to really think about this more sensibly, and that is the fact that you have lots and lots of different speakers out there, and your speakers may be registering true to your own ear, and you may have the best ear in the world. However, if your particular speakers aren't registering certain frequencies, or they're not registering correctly, you're not always going to pick up some of this scope. Okay, and that's where metering and analyzing tools come in, and they should definitely always be used. No matter how good your ear is, they should always be used, because after all, what we're looking for is consistency. We're looking at things that kind of just work. Okay, and if you don't use all the tools that are available to you, and you limit yourself in that way, you're not going to make the most out of it, and you're not going to kind of push yourself for this and hit the higher level of audience as well. So definitely important. I'm going to go over to the Q&As in a second, see if we've got anyone asking any questions. So if you haven't already asked a question, please do so, and I'll try and answer that now for the next few minutes. Further resources. So I've kind of skipped over this, and it was a bit of a quick whirlwind tour. But I've also got a presentation on EQs and filters on the Music Tech Student site. Now, this does include different examples and different exercises as well, so it's worth having a little look. And there's a couple of audio examples to kind of show you how it's working as well. So head on over there. That is a premium area, so you will need a Music Tech Student.co.uk account or subscription. But go over and have a look at that. Well worth the visit. Okay, let's see if we've got any questions. So let's open that one. We haven't got any there. Open this one. Last one before we sign off for the evening. Now it looks like we are out, and that's absolutely fine. No worries. And if you guys have any questions during the week, please email me, and I will get on to them and include them in the show for next week. So you can email us in any way you want. The next week's show is going to be on sonic qualities again, but we're going to be looking at the stereo field and how to kind of control your instruments across the stereo field, and we're going to look at common conventions for doing that as well. So please tune in next week, and thanks for seeing us tonight, and we'll see you next time.